episode of Stories of the Supernatural. Whether you're watching a video or listening to a podcast, please like and subscribe to us so that you can get notification of when a new show is released. Links to videos or MP3 files can be found on MiamiGhostChronicles.com. Go to MarlenePardo.com for information on new book releases. I narrate several podcast series that can be found on major podcast platforms and can also be listened to via Alexa, Sonos, and other home systems. Look for Supernatural Storytime for scary storytelling, Nightshade Diary for classic horror and adventure stories, Stories of the Supernatural for interviews with different guests on the show. If you want to get noteworthy news about the paranormal world, true crime, conspiracy stories, and anything that is just plain weird, you can visit Strange Than Fiction Stories tab at MiamiGhostChronicles.com or find us on Blogspot. I want to thank you for being part of my audience, and I think you are all wonderful. Hi, everybody. How's everybody doing today? Good. I'm doing good. Great. Even though the show's going to be a little bit staggered, I'm going to still say Happy Veterans Day because we're doing this November 11th. So thanks to all of you who served in the armed forces. And that includes my youngest son who was in the Navy for 5 years. Anyway, let's get on to the good stuff. I know everybody's been asking me, you haven't shown us your Chicken Kingdom videos. You know what? I'm going to be going out and I'm going to do videos with some of my special chickens that I have, that I hatched and I, basically nurtured. I want to do a video on that next time around, guys. I promise. I'll bring in the characters because I do have characters, even though I have a free range flock, I have some that, like I said, I have my 8-year-old and I have some that now I think about it, maybe they're going on 3 or 4 years old that basically I hatched them in an incubator and some of them got sick. And I learned a lot about chickens during that period, but I promise the next episode, I'm going to do a little intro for the video portion, not the podcast, obviously, of me in Chicken Kingdom. Now, next thing, guys, sign up for my newsletter. Go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com or MarlenePardo.com, and you can sign up for my newsletter. It comes out once a week only. And usually I have some article, ghost stories, true crime, something interesting. And I also have links to any of my related videos or podcasts. And if I have anything that's going on with my books, for example, when I just released the last true crime one, the Hot Dame on a Cold Slab, for 15 days, I had 100 book giveaway on Amazon through Goodreads. So, I announced it on that newsletter. And the reason why sometimes it's easier to do that is that I can time it better sometimes than the video. So sign up for my newsletter. Second thing, I've got a new sponsor. Okay. And this new sponsor, their name is Plan to Stay Safe. And basically what they do is they ask you, how do you plan to stay safe? They offer stun guns, pepper sprays, hidden cameras, diversion safes, knives, Kubotans, any of the non-lethal things that you can carry to stay safe. They have a lot of camping supplies, sporting goods supplies, things of that nature. And best of all, in the United States, if you order $50 or more, you get free delivery. USA only, free delivery on any order, $50 and over. All right. So go ahead, check them out. They are at plantostaysafe.com, plantostaysafe.com. Check them out. They've usually got daily deals. Like I said, that no cost for $50 and over order. That's great. No shipping charge. So by all means, go ahead and check them out. Now let's get on to the good part. The good part is the guest. This is a first-time guest for Stories of the Supernatural. And I'm very excited because when I say who it is, I am sure that you are very familiar with this gentleman. Okay. Because he has been involved in the paranormal world as far as shows, books, you name it. All right. Drum roll. Okay. The guest today is Jeff Belanger. Okay. And I'd like to for you to help me welcome him. How are you doing today, Jeff?
And thanks for having me on. I'm unmuted now.
Nah, exactly. Yeah, that's me. Getting to.
I was lip syncing before.
My audience is like, oh, Marlene, there she goes again. So anyway, Jeff, let me fill in my all my it's
I'm
like
not here if that's for me. If that phone
I'm
call's for
telling
me,
you,
tell them.
I kid
I'm
you
not
not.
here.
You know what it is? I have my phone on silent. The only exception are my children, which by the way are adults, because I'm thinking they're adults. The only time they're calling me is mom. So of course, impeccable timing. That's my son calling me.
Take the call. See how he's doing.
No.
Tell him
If he's
happy,
calling me, no. It'll be something. Today is he's on his day off, so he calls me about stuff that Sometimes we trade ideas on books and stories. So, he's my writer. He's my kid that turned out to be a writer. But anyway, let me get on to Jeff. Obviously, and this is his bio. He's an author, a podcaster, storyteller, adventurer, explorer of the unexplained. He's written more than a dozen books that have been published in 6 languages. He's the Emmy-nominated host, writer, and producer of the New England Legends series on PBS and Amazon Prime. He provides programs and lectures to audiences all over the world, and he's been the writer and researcher for every episode of Ghost Adventures on the Travel Channel. Jeff has made media appearances on hundreds of radio and television programs over his 20-year career, and he has a passion for mysteries and legends. Yay!
Thanks.
So
I do.
Yes, and let me tell you something. Despite what people think, that sometimes that to me that's a fascinating. So many things fall under that umbrella of whether it's mysteries, legends, folklore, paranormal, whatever you want to call it.
Sure.
It's to me it's endless. Let me ask you something, Jeff. How did you get interested in this? Childhood experience? What happened?
Yeah, so I grew up in New England, and I think I was just sort of steeped in a tradition of haunts. I didn't live in a haunted house, though. I had a friend down the street who did, and his house was built in 1760, which I always thought was interesting. I mean, at the time it was built, we were England. We weren't even America
right,
yet.
Exactly.
And they'd say like, yeah, sometimes we see this old guy walk down the hall and just disappear. And I'm like, are you kidding? Like, is that grandpa? Like, who is that? He's like, we don't know, but it doesn't bother us and we're not scared. And I thought, this is amazing. And I also grew up in the town next to Ed and Lorraine Warren. So they're from Monroe, Connecticut. I lived in Sandy Hook, Connecticut. And so I would go attend their library programs and things like that in October and hear their stories and see their evidence. And I thought, this is amazing. Like, what an incredible thing. And so I went to school to be a writer and started as a journalist, a features writer. And around October, you go looking for these kind of stories. So it was the mid 90s that I started writing about ghosts and haunts for October. Went on the newspaper's website and they said, wow, your paranormal articles get 10 times the traffic of everything else combined. And so I started my own website, ghostvillage.com, back in 1999. And it's still going. And it's just, it's not a career I planned. It's just, then I got a book deal and then I started writing more books and then I started working for Ghost Adventures. And then, one day you kind of wake up and say, oh my goodness, this is my full-time job. And I'm so grateful for it.
Sure. Exactly. It's like, it's that what you say that it's not a job, even though it's a job, but it's a passion. So it doesn't feel a lot of times like a job, because you're doing what you love.
Sure, totally. But at the same time, I have bills like everybody else. And this is how I pay them. So it's, you do like a million different things. Like Ghost Adventures is great and writing books is great, but like none of them alone are enough to, pay for a family and a house and things like that. And so, but at the same time, I think that suits me well because I couldn't do any one thing for too long, One of the things I love about these stories is that, like on Ghost Adventures, every episode is a new place, a new thing to learn, a new, what's behind this haunt? Why is this place haunted? And every building has its own unique story. And so, pretty much every single week of my life, I'm working on something new. And that just keeps
a lot of research, I bet, huh?
Yeah. Oh, a ton of research. Yeah. Because for me, when you say a place is haunted, the backstory, the history, that's the stage that you set the ghosts on. I mean, if you went to see a play and all the actors walked out on stage and they're all dressed completely in black and the stage is completely black and the curtains are completely black and there's nothing and they walk out and they start talking, you're going to be confused. Well, what year is it? Where are we? Are we in the city? Are we in the country? Are we in an apartment? Are we out in a field? There's no context whatsoever. And so your brain doesn't know how to process the words you're hearing. And it's a lot of work and a lot of time to catch up.
Yes.
A lot of paranormal television shows just go to a location and go, okay, they say this place is haunted. Let's start doing EVP. And you go, oh, well, that's the stage without any setting. You know, I mean, I don't understand it. And I need to put it into some context, because that allows me to connect with whatever might potentially be there.
Right. And I mean, I understand I'm a little bit older than you. And I remember when I was a kid, the only library books were Hans Holzer. And, a lot of his stories took place in the Northeast. That was his stomping ground when he would do that stuff. And then, of course, it graduated into, you got other shows like In Search Of, and then, diversified. But I absolutely agree with you that sometimes research, sometimes the usual suspects aren't the usual suspects. And when you do the research, you realize, man, there's a lot of dark history here beyond maybe the stories that are told.
Well, sure. And at the same time, like, I mean, to me, the simplest definition of a ghost is that it's the past coming to the present, right? I've said it's history demanding to be remembered. And so it begs us to go back. And one thing we've learned repeatedly is that history does repeat itself. And we don't often learn the lessons of the past. And that haunts us, I mean, there's reasons places like Gettysburg are haunted, and these old battlefields and murder sites and stuff like that. It haunts us. It literally haunts us.
Well, and I don't know if you found this as well. Sometimes when you're talking about the good old days, and let's say where we're doing something that's in the past, a lot of times they try to couch things. Sometimes I want to say, sometimes they were very descriptive, but other times they didn't want to expose, let's say, certain families to some type of scandal. So you have to really dig around to get the truth as to, hey, what really happened here? So was it a suicide or was it a murder kind of thing?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, of course. Yeah, some of those are family, dark family secrets that are protected. But I also found that different parts of the world treat their haunts differently. So for example, you go to England, you go to Europe, parts of Europe, and they're just so matter of fact about their haunts. It's not a big thing. Yeah, that building's haunted. That one isn't. Whatever. What do you want for lunch? And it doesn't have to be a big discussion. I think in New England, where I live, there's a lot of that sensibility that it's just like, yeah, they say that's haunted. That's okay. It doesn't bother me. And but then other parts of the world and the country, like, we don't speak about that, or it immediately takes on a religious tone. This is from God or from the devil. That's the only two.
Sure, no in between.
Yeah, there's no gray area. And I guess I was raised Catholic, in the interest of full disclosure. And Catholicism, we've got an entire spectrum, right? We've got God and the devil, and we've got angels and demons, and we've got sinners and saints, and we've got purgatory. What the hell is purgatory?
Well,
right?
I tell everybody, even Hollywood, if let's say you got a case of possession, eventually you go to the big guns, which is the Catholic priest.
Well, yeah, they certainly bring a lot of drama to it, and I mean, other religions have exorcism as well. I once got to interview Rabbi Gershon Winkler, who wrote a book called Dybbuk, which is about Jewish possession and Jewish exorcism, and it's sort of beautiful the way they treat it. They treat it as two spirits need healing. There's a living spirit and a spirit of someone who's already passed on, and they both need to be separated and healed. As opposed to Catholicism, which is, I vanquish you to hell and brimstone and and it's like, and I was like, oh, Rabbi Winkler, they're never going to make a Hollywood movie about your exorcism. It's too calm and nice and not enough drama. And so, yeah, I guess when it gets real, people turn to the Catholics because, the movie The Exorcist.
I was going to say, after The Exorcist, it ruined it for everybody else. Yeah, all the other religions. I'm saying. Yeah,
no, I've seen it 137 times, and it gets funnier each time, right? So,
well, you know what? I tell everybody, this came out in 1973. I was 13 here. Everybody, I snuck off and I went to see it behind my mother's back because my mom. I went through 12 years of Catholic school, by the way. So I'm like, so my mom. Goods. At that time, the newspapers were already writing stories, and my mom says, absolutely, besides the fact that you're 13, and I think it was rated R at that time.
Oh, it's still rated R. You cannot go
see this movie. Right.
Yeah.
But my uncle was much younger. Her brother, him and his wife, they were newly married. And I told my mom, I'm going to go see Day of the Dolphin. By the way, that was another movie that was out. I lied. Well, after I saw the first 15 minutes of it, and then the rest of the time I was looking at the theater floor, I remember when I got home, I didn't tell my mom, but I slept with her. And I was like all over her. She's like, "What's wrong with you?" You know. But then, like you said, you fast forward, and as an adult, you look at it and it's like, all right. But I
It's
could
still
see
scary.
it was. But see, you know what? I remember back then, and I think the audiences were more innocent. This is why everybody wigged out so bad
Yeah.
when they saw it, because everybody was like, "What?" Because back then, we weren't as jaded as an audience as we were back then. Back then we were very innocent. I'm saying
Yeah.
overall, and
Well,
that was like, I'm going to lose my soul. Oh my God.
so I've interviewed priests about that movie, and old time priests who said, after that came out, there was a line out the door of the rectory of people thinking they needed an exorcism, and
Yes.
and then you also have to put that movie into the context of the times. It was 1973, and 1980 was, that movie was still relatively fresh. I mean, everybody had seen it come 1980, and then you of course have the Satanic Panic, right?
Yes.
And what was happening was, Satan was becoming a real force to be reckoned with. He was being named quite a bit. And that's happened throughout history, right? Satan has a very fascinating history of he's called in when we need him, right?
Yeah.
So at the
Right.
time they were attacking heavy metal music, and Dungeons and Dragons
Yes, that's
and
right.
scary horror movies. And meanwhile, the Catholic Church was performing abhorrent crimes on children right
Well,
along and
because that
hiding it.
was
Yeah.
and nobody would ever think of accusing a priest back,
Nope.
before these scandals, because if you were a child, you could get in trouble.
Yeah, no,
Let's
I know.
say.
And so meanwhile, they're casting aspersions on people playing Dungeons and Dragons and listening to Ozzy
Yeah.
Osbourne and doing unspeakable acts and crimes. And
Yes.
so I think the whole thing's interesting. It really is. And
No.
you put
No.
it all into like
And
a context.
absolutely. And even tell everybody, not what a few weeks ago there was a big scandal that broke out in France. The same thing with the Catholic Church and cases of molestation. And I mean, in other words, this was not like a few persons that
Yeah, I
did
know.
something. This is very widespread, unfortunately. And you're absolutely right. And what's really funny is, of course, when they took it to the devil, it wasn't a ghost. It wasn't like a ghost was scary enough.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
it went to the point of the devil.
Well,
And
yeah, devils and demons, and we've become more extreme in our culture,
oh yeah,
and so a ghost isn't scary enough,
oh
and
no,
so we've got to go to this like preternatural creature that's just out to get us. And the interesting, I started working on a project about the devil, specifically the devil in New England, just where he shows up and how he shows up. I mean, we've got hundreds of locations named after the devil. We've got like Devil's Foot Road and like Devil's Coffin and Devil's Corn Crib and Devil's Den and
corn
like
grip. I
like
love that.
like all these various like locations, whether it's a street or part of a mountain or a gully or Purgatory Chasm, like all these names, it comes up again and again. And these names are old, they go back centuries
Yes,
sometimes. And I think our puritanical roots show up. For them, the devil was not a metaphor. The devil
no,
was literal. And so by naming so many locations after him, by keeping him on everybody's mind, you on the one hand, you give him quite a bit of power, which is
sure.
ironic, right? The thing you
Well,
fear, you're supercharging, and yet and yet his influence sort of sticks around, and his influence waxes and wanes. And the more we try to label something as satanic, so that's what we saw in the 80s, the Satanic Panic, right? Ozzy Osbourne was under attack from from various church groups for
well,
making
I think
heavy
that
metal music.
yeah, anything that, I mean, come on, I even remember when Madonna came out with like a virgin, and
Hmm.
it was like, oh my God, it's sacrilegious.
Well, sure. And well, she was pushing boundaries.
Sure.
And you know what? Like, I get it. Culture moves when boundaries are
Right.
pushed. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
You can't stay in the safe little box forever. And that's what art does. Our artists have always led the way. They've been doing that for millennia. I mean,
Yes.
art and music, writers, poets, musicians, painters, dancers, uh, theater, it has always been at the forefront of pushing those boundaries. I mean, depending on your perspective, some people, and change is scary. I get it. Some people look at
Sure.
that and say, "Oh
Absolutely, it
no,
is.
that's not how our society is supposed to work. That's not how I grew up." And so therefore it must be wrong. But the reality is that's the direction the needle has moved for tens of thousands of years and always will move. And we just sort of have to understand that culture evolves, And I think it's ironic that sometimes haunts and ghosts and legends are the things that do connect us back to those days. And sometimes maybe we do push things too far, and we have examples of that from the past, right? And so we sort of harken back. And so ghosts don't have to be scary; they can almost be nostalgic.
Yes.
The fiddler that shows up in the corner of the old tavern and then disappears, and you're like, oh, things were simpler then. We weren't listening to streaming music. We had a lot. You know what? Maybe we should get some live music in here again. You know what I mean? Like, what if it's just that, right? Just this thing that connects us to a simpler time, and a time when, I don't know. I personally believe people connect better over a live musician than if you just have a streaming service playing over a speaker in a bar,
Of course.
So
absolutely.
It's
Absolutely. And you know what? I think also, and I say, don't get me wrong. I like when the people they do the research and, they give a back history, but sometimes some of these stories, folklore, whatever you want to call them, like exactly like what you described, which is great. It's like, you don't need an explanation of why the ghost is appearing or maybe who he is. Okay.
Right.
Or if he's still there or not. It's just a story. Exactly what you said, where it lends an air of nostalgia, or like you said, something that occurred or was part of the history, let's say a certain building, and that's it. That's all it is. You have to enjoy it for what it is. It doesn't have to be explained 20 times over, or to you to get is like, did that really happen? It's like, not every ghost stories. You have to do that.
But at the same time, I personally believe that a ghost story doesn't survive unless it gets reinforced. So, for example, if we went to some old building, pick a town, doesn't matter, and we said, oh, there's a ghost in there, and we told 2 or 3 people, that story is it's going to die out. Like, that building doesn't become haunted just because we said so. It becomes haunted when someone else has an experience and says, hey, you know what? I was in there once and I saw something weird in the corner. And then someone else says, are you kidding me? My dad used to work in that building and I used to get freaked out when I'd go to visit him. And then, like, that's so I actually believe there's often a catalyst that sort of makes this legend grow. Otherwise we wouldn't talk about it.
Well, there was, as a matter of fact, there was close to where I live back in the 80s, there was one of these antique shops, and the managers, both of them, they got robbed and shot. And later on, there were stories. The perpetrators eventually were convicted, but there were stories then of ghosts happenings. Now you have to understand also, because it's a huge antique area. Some people could say, is it the antiques or has it had to do with that crime? But anyway, somebody wrote a piece about it, and then people it's like a blog. But it's surprising how many people have listed their own experiences while visiting there.
Yeah, of course.
Okay. And again, it's like, was it the crime, or was it just because it's filled with all these old pieces that maybe there's something that's the source of it, in other words? But yes, exactly what you said. You hear all these stories of people. I walked in there, I saw a shadow, I've heard voices, I felt somebody behind me. And these are people absolutely have no connection one between the other. And they describe having experiences that, not with the internet, where people can actually go ahead and retell what happened.
Yeah, and then it gets folklore works the same way it always worked. It's just faster now because, back then you had a weird experience, you'd tell someone, they might tell someone else, and it could take years before that reputation grew. Now, you post it online and someone else replies and says, I had something like that happen too. By lunchtime, you can have
exactly.
Like what used to take years can take like 2-3 hours now. And but it's the same function. It's still one person telling another and another sharing and becoming part of the story and so on. And I think this is what, people sometimes scoff who are very hardcore into researching paranormal. I said, look, any paranormal show you have ever seen in your life, any episode of any show, Leonard Nimoy, In Search of, like all of them, everyone, 100% started with a story. Someone heard something, right? If you were really doing objective scientific research, you wouldn't go to a haunted building. You'd be like, hey, this Walmart was built 3 weeks ago. Let's go in and look for ghosts. Like, let's use this as a control, right? But we don't do that because it's not interesting. No one's been there long enough to have anything weird happen beyond the normal weird stuff that happens at Walmart. So we're not we're chasing stories. We always were.
Right. And I'm sure you've heard of that famous the Toys R Us out in
Yeah, yeah,
California.
yeah.
This was
Sure.
that
The
it was
photo.
haunted, and then later on it figured out that it was supposedly something that happened on the land.
Hmm. Yeah,
You know, where weird things have happened. And I tell somebody sometimes that's where you get new buildings and or houses, and stuff starts to happen is what was on that land before then. Okay.
sure. No,
Sometimes things are documented, other times they're not.
construction doesn't have to be old to be haunted.
No,
There's a
yes.
couple of stories I worked on. I interviewed a woman who owned a house, say like Tennessee. It was a new house, like it was less than 10 years old. No one had died in it. And she said she was in her basement doing her laundry. And you know how basements have windows at the top, So she said she looked out the window and she saw these feet walking like 2 feet above the grass, like hovering,
Okay.
and walking by. And she's like, what the hell is this? And she would do some research and she learned that this house is on land that was once a Civil War field hospital. And the grass, of course, was graded down when a lawn was put in. And, before it was graded, that might have been ground level, just a couple feet higher. And so she thinks she caught a glimpse of, something that happened, when it was a Civil War field hospital.
Sure.
One of the most famous haunts on the West Coast is the Whaley House out in
Yes.
San Diego,
I've
California.
been there, yes.
Yeah, so the Whaley House, Thomas Whaley believed his house was haunted in the first week it was built. Whaley witnessed the hanging of Yankee Jim Robinson right on those grounds. That was the public hanging grounds. And
Right.
Yankee Jim Robinson was hanged for literally borrowing, I know technically
I know, but
stealing
it's kind of extreme
boat.
what he got. Yeah.
Right. It was like they made an example of him. They're like, you can't,
Mhm.
we're gonna teach the world a lesson by hanging you. And he, even when they put the rope around his neck, he's like, they're just kidding. This is a joke. And then they weren't. And the rope, he was a tall guy. The rope was not the right length, and he strangled to death. He didn't snap his neck.
Right.
And
That's a very
Whaley,
slow, agonizing death, by the way.
so Whaley builds this house, and the first week he hears these boot steps coming up the stairs and realizes there's no one there. And he writes in his journal, I think it's haunted by Yankee Jim. I watched him die right here on these grounds. I mean, so that's brand new construction, 1 week old, and he thought it was haunted.
Yeah, but let me tell you something. But didn't he incorporate the gallows? Wasn't it right there, part of the house, or something like that? Or
I think,
or because the courthouse, it was like really weird. It was like one of those things where like, why would you live there? But back then you have to. I think people don't realize back then you had to be practical.
right. So it was his house, it was a store, and it was a courtroom.
Right.
Like it
Right.
was a lot of things, and because that's how he paid for it. He could rent out the courtroom. He had the store to sell goods, and he lived there. So no, it's one of those just great American stories, and
Yes.
and one of the great American haunts. And I think they sell T-shirts that say like the world's most haunted house or whatever. And
Right. And I mean, I went there, but I went in the middle of the day. I wasn't doing the tourist thing,
sure,
And let's face it. I mean, I sat in there. But in the middle of the day, it's like, there's so many ambient noise going on around that if anything weird happened, or we wouldn't notice it anyway.
no, of
But
course,
and it has that cemetery right next to it, the Camposanto. This was like a pioneer cemetery right next to it.
but that's where
Because of,
Yankee Jim is buried. He's
yes,
he's a block down the road, and if you happen to be there, go right across the street from that cemetery, and you can get a damn fine margarita at the Mexican restaurant.
yeah,
Just saying.
it's like looking for spirits.
I always find spirits, never fail. Yeah.
Well, this is the thing that because people don't realize back then, because they think of San Diego as in San Diego, but back then it was much smaller, more concentrated. And by
Yeah.
the way, that area, like you said, this is where everybody hung out. This was like the gathering area, the courthouse,
Yeah.
merchants. This was like, yeah, absolutely. A lot of things like that do happen. That now is poor Jim still walking around? Is it residual? Because he also had a daughter that died or tried to commit suicide, right? Violet?
I don't know about that. Whaley did. Yeah,
Wait,
Whaley did.
Judge Whaley. Yeah, that he.
I believe she shot herself in the privy in the
Right.
back, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yes.
So yeah, no, there was sort of like, an air of tragedy all around that land.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's one of those great American haunts. Every show's filmed there. Ghost Adventures filmed there. I've been there.
Mhm.
Like it's one of those places that just sort of keeps coming up when you're looking for haunts.
Yes.
And it does, that section of town is called Old Town San Diego. and it's called that for a reason. I mean, this was the part of town that was, like the original little village that it once was before LA sprawled in all directions and became, it just basically took over Southern California.
Well, I'm going to give you, here in Miami, there's a very famous hotel called the Biltmore Hotel, and
Sure.
it was built 1920s, and it got the reputation for being haunted because supposedly back in during Prohibition, there was a gangster named Fats, I can't remember his last name, got shot up on the 13th floor. But during the time that it was open, it was a really nice hotel. This is where you had to have money to go in there, and then of course the Depression came in, and they're always trying to tie the ghost stories in, but people don't realize that during the Second World War, it was used as a hospital for soldiers.
Yeah, sure.
And they very little connect any of the ghost stories to the time that it was a hospital. To be honest with you, I would think they closed it down for a while. And I visited back in the 80s. As a matter of fact, they had and I was looking in before they renovated. Now it's beautiful again. And supposedly I would think that if there was a source for a ghost, the source for me would probably be more from the soldiers that were there recovering and or dying, versus one guy, a gangster that got killed on the 13th floor, shot to death.
Sure.
And I've spoken to people that, like, in the kitchens, especially the kitchens of the hotel of all places, have a lot of weird stuff going on there. Everybody's looking at the penthouse 13th floor. And from what I understand, people that work there, how can I say, the area where the visitors don't go, where the guests are not there, the kitchens and that area where the people serve, that's where things are going on as far as the Biltmore. Sure. No, and that's why I'm saying that sometimes the typical suspect is not, the usual suspect is not really the one that's causing all the hauntings or any of the paranormal events. It's a totally different source.
I call it most famous phenomena, where like anytime there's a ghost somewhere, you tie it to the most famous person who's been there, died there, visited there. Yes. There's countless bed and breakfasts around Virginia, and they say like George Washington slept here, and they're old because they were around in the 1700s, and a lot of them have haunted reputations, and it's George Washington. He's haunting 30 different bed and breakfasts where he spent like 2 nights, passing through town all those years ago.
He's a busy ghost. He shows up
right, and he's gonna haunt it forever. And I love that, right? Because it's not the gardener who got drunk and fell off the roof and died there in 1955, right? It's George Washington who came here for tea once, and
right.
And if the tea was so good, so very good, that he's here for all eternity, and that's where he's going to haunt. It gives us comfort, and the reality is we're dealing with the unknown, and if we can put a label on it, it makes us feel better, even if we're wrong, even if we're absolutely wrong. If we can say, oh, that knocking you hear on the wall right now, George Washington, yeah, the guy on the dollar,
I can tell. Right? I just can tell the way he's that knocking. It's very
that's
presidential.
How he knocked. That was his knock. Everybody knows that. And so you just go, oh, really? But it's just a knock. That it's not like we see him and go, oh yeah, that's George. Like, no, it's but we feel a little bit better, feeling like we put a name on it. And and I see that all the time. I mean, I've seen that with people that are dealing with haunts in their homes or whatever. Like, that's my grandfather. He'd never hurt us. Okay. I mean, I don't know, maybe it is, but do you know for sure? Probably not. But we do that.
It is like, I mean, besides that, it's like I think a lot of times people are scared to entertain somebody that isn't grandpa.
Right. Of course. Oh, that's that masked killer that died right in front of this house, back in 1920. He's just probably still bumping around. That's scary. You want to think like, no, it's grandpa. He's a nice guy.
Of course. Well, I tell everybody I was doing paranormal investigations before that. That's really since the 1990s. I tell everybody by the time back then, I said, by the time somebody reached out, by the way, very, very low key to somebody like myself, they had run out of options. They had gone to the electrician, to the plumber, they had done the research. Okay. Versus now, in other words, by the time they got there, they were like pulling their hair out, literally. Nowadays, somebody hears a noise, everybody runs out and sleeps in the car. Right away, It's the ghost versus, my lights are blinking because maybe I've got an electrical short somewhere, or the
Sure.
plumbing, something's going on with the plumbing, or I've got an animal stuck in some tight space there, can't get out.
Yeah.
Or, because, and back then, by the time, that's what I'm saying, the difference as far as how people, like you were saying, view this. Back then, it was very low key, and it was like, I don't want my house to be haunted. In a way, I'm talking here. I'm not talking historical places.
Yeah.
I'm talking everyday houses
Homes. Yeah.
where people were like, no, no, no. I've brought in everybody. I've had everything tested, and there's nothing wrong. And
Yeah.
it's like, now we've crossed off all the possibles, and we're left with something supernatural as an agent causing the disturbance.
Yeah,
Now,
it is scary.
now all the
People
opposite.
start with it. Yeah, people start with it's haunted, and they don't even check out those other things.
No,
It's
no.
yeah, that's a concern. And I can tell you, like, because of what I do in my work with Ghost Adventures, which is a really popular show. I mean, I've been doing that since episode 1, and it's been
Wow. What is it? 13, 14? How many years is it now?
13 years. 13
Something
years
like
we've
that.
been doing
Yeah,
it.
yeah, yeah.
No, I know exactly what it's been. It's been 13 years, and which is amazing. Like, what a run.
Mhm.
And we're still going. I can tell you, we're working on new episodes right now. And but one of the things that happens is I'll get emails from people that are just like, hey, I think my house is haunted. And I get a fair amount of those emails, and I go, okay, I'm reading, I'm listening. This is happening, that's happening. I'm like, okay, interesting. And then it says, I really need to get Zach here from Ghost Adventures. And I'm like, you lost me, I'm out. Right. Because if you think your house is haunted and you think you need help and you're reaching out to someone like me, I get all that. But when you say, no, it's got to be Zach, you got to get a TV star here to help me.
Yes.
I'm like, you don't have a real problem. If you had a real problem, you wouldn't care if it was Zach or anybody else. Right. You'd say, like, can anybody come help me with this?
Yes.
Now, sometimes I get emails that say, I do not want to be on TV. I don't want to be in any of your books.
That right there is a good sign.
Public. And then I go, oh, you have my full attention now.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like, oh, all right. Well, then let me read this carefully. As soon as I see Zach's name in the email, I'm like, boop, delete. I'm not his agent. I'm not his middleman. You thinking that's the solution? Forget it.
Right. And I tell everybody, there's that, to me, that was usually a good sign. Well, back then, because I tell everybody, this was when you had to pay to develop film to put it in context of how long ago this was.
I remember.
But now it's, and I'm going to say, for modern, where you have to tell the family or the person, there's nothing really here. We discovered, hey, do you know that you've got some cables there that are peeling back some electrical? Oh, you sure? It's got to be haunted. I'm like, no, not really. Yeah. They're kind of disappointed in that regard. And I'm thinking to myself, you really don't know, what you're asking for as far as, some people that have experienced true hauntings. And I'm not talking anything residual, which is, like you said, a certain smell or a certain noise or stares, and it's just a loop. There's nothing there. Or something that's a little bit more disturbing is like, why would you want that in your house? Do you realize really what you're asking for?
Well, sure. But yeah, and I think too, I remember working on we were filming this, it's called a Sizzle. It's not even a pilot. It's like a Sizzle Reel for like a show that never got made. No shock. Anyway, this house, they had a lot of issues. So I walked in and they said their house is haunted and they have all these problems. And if they could just get the demon out, everything would be okay.
Oh, the D word.
And so I'm a snooper. And if you invite me into your house, and I go to the bathroom, I'm looking in your medicine cabinet. I'm sorry. I'm going to do it there. Yes. Now, don't invite me in if you don't want me to look. And so beyond that, we're kind of walking around and I look on the kitchen table and there's a stack of bills and I just sort of fan through them and they're all past due. And I go, okay. And then I look on the fridge and there's a summons from the police for mandatory violence training. And I look out in the backyard and they have an in-ground swimming pool. And it was like the middle of July and the swimming pool still has its winter cover on it. Now I know it costs a lot of money to open and close a swimming pool each season. You got to buy a bunch of chemicals. It's expensive. And so obviously past due bills is a big stress on the family. The pool's not open, so they don't even have the money for that. Someone's got to go to violence training. There was open bottles of liquor in every room. There was just a bottle somewhere nearby. And then the teenage daughter walks in and her two eyes couldn't focus on the same spot. I'm like, she's on drugs. And so I was like, let's say I could, speed dial the Pope, which I could. and I get him down here like in the Pope helicopter, like in the next hour, which I absolutely could do. I could do that. I have that power. I have him on speed dial. And he comes in with super soaker squirt guns full of holy water. And he's just, dousing the house. And he's got incense burning and he's whipping them around in his head. And he's doing cartwheels and like the super Pope exorcism, this thing that only I can get because I know him so well. And it's a favor I can call in and only me. Let's say I did all that. As soon as it's over and the smoke clears and the Pope's like wiping the sweat from his brow and getting back in the super sleek helicopter and flying back to the Vatican, you're still going to be an alcoholic. Your daughter's still on drugs. You still have violence issues. Your bills are still past due.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that does not go away with an exorcism. And so I was like, we got to solve these other problems before we could even think about something that could be, deeper than that. Because you guys are under an enormous amount of stress and you've got chemical dependency and you've got, violence issues. Like this is not a good place to be right now.
Right. Well, and the help I can offer is not the help you need, at least for that
right.
part.
Yeah. Like my help would be like, let me get you the phone book back when there were phone books. And let's start looking for psychologists. Let's start looking for rehabs. Let's look for like credit counselors, like let's call them in first. And the problem though, is that I'm like, so I'm saying all this and I literally got kicked off of the shoot, which was great. Fine. Like totally cool. Like, I'm like, I don't want to be part of this anyway.
Yes.
But the thing is they'll kick us out of there and they'll call another group that'll come in and go, oh yeah, you have demons. And they'll tell them what they want to hear.
Yes.
I mean, I've seen people do it. Like they'll call in 3 or 4 paranormal groups until they get the answer they want to hear. And that's not helping people.
I one time I went on an investigation. Again, this was way back. When you got the red eye, from when you took pictures before digital per se. Right. When you had the red eye, I had one lady. She calls us in. She's just nice, beautiful house, great neighborhood, and we're there. And she goes, "Oh, I want to." She's claimed that they were writing messages on her bathroom mirror. Okay, it was gone. Yeah, but we're snapping pictures. I've got one of the other investigators. He's a professional photographer. He's just snapping pictures with this nice, sleek, ultra modern equipment. She calls me over and she goes, "Look, I want to show you these pictures." I'm like, "Sure, show them to me." And here she is. She's sitting at like the dining room table. She's looking up, and her eyes, when they get that red glare, that's normal. That's from the flash.
Sure.
She's trying to show them to me, like making them look like I'm possessed, kind of like. And I'm looking at them, and I'm like, and I'm thinking to myself, "Oh, this is not good. This is not good." When you're basically trying to tell me that and then she's giving me the story. She comes from a long line of psychics and seers and mediums, but I've got red eyes because in this picture, I'm like, your credibility just went out the door because it's like, okay, things like that. People sometimes, for lack of a better word, they manufacture it. And whether there's something supernatural or not, unfortunately, when their credibility is shot, it's really difficult to regain the trust.
Well, I've seen people too that sort of need it, for whatever reason. Sometimes people need, they need to feel something's there with them for comfort or whatever. Mm-hmm. And like, I get it. We're all struggling, getting through our day to day. And so it's just, and I believe in ghosts, by the way. Like I do. I've seen things I can't explain. Mm-hmm. But I've also found them to be, I've been doing this, over 20 years and all over the world in some of the creepiest places on the planet. And I can count on one hand how many times I've seen something where I went, whoa, I can't explain that.
Exactly.
So at the same, I'm not saying it's not happening. I know it's happening to other people, but I guess I look at a story and I try to come at it from every angle. Like, why you? Why now? Why this? What else is going on? What's important to you? What do you want? And then, of course, sometimes you deal with families that are like, our house is haunted, but we like it. We don't want it gone. There's we don't feel
they're good with it. They're good with it.
We're not threatened in any way. It's just sort of there. It's sort of somewhat comforting to feel like there's some spirit of the house that overlooks things that, while we're there or not. And like, we're totally fine with it. I'm like, great. Then no harm, no foul. Totally good. But no one makes movies out of those stories.
That's too vanilla. The scare factor is too low.
Yeah. So, but at the same time, like there's tons of stories like that. And the most common accounts people tell me about are usually loved ones. It's usually, like grandma died 2 weeks ago and I saw her in my kitchen and she smiled at me and then just sort of melted away. And I felt like that was the goodbye that I didn't get.
Sure.
And like, and it's actually heartwarming. It's not scary at all.
Mhm.
It's very,
Yeah.
very loving. And I think that's sort of beautiful, but that's not the stuff you hear about. But that's what I hear about. Those are the
Sure.
stories people tell me.
Yeah, you hear of I had a friend of mine who her grandfather was in another country. And she says one day he used to wear like a cowboy hat. And she says one day she's looking down the hallway of her house and she sees him cross like the hallway from one room to the other. And she goes, first off, I knew what my grandfather looked like, but he had his cowboy hat on. But he was in
Yeah.
another country. So she said, I knew something had happened to him. And like later in the day, they got note that he had passed away. Apparently he wasn't sick. In other words, he passed away suddenly.
Sure.
And she says, once I saw him, I wasn't scared. And I just saw him cross the hallway from one room to the other. And I knew it was him. And it was like, it's impossible for that to really be him. But she said she wasn't scared. And the family was, and she told her family later on what she had seen. And everybody was good with it. And everybody took it as he's like what you said. He was here for his last goodbye.
Sure.
And to let everybody know I'm good. I'm okay.
Yeah. No, I totally get it. And I think that's, I think we're all connected. I've
Yeah.
never found a haunting or a ghost when there's not a living person somewhere in the equation, ever.
Of course.
Right. I mean, and so even if you say like, hey, I put in all these like, closed circuit cameras in a house and we left it empty. Well, you're watching the closed circuit cameras. You're still in the equation. You're just not literally there. And so I don't think one can exist without the other. I think there's this sort of like symbiotic relationship between us and our ghosts. And I haven't figured it out. If I did, I swear I would tell people. I wouldn't withhold that. If I knew where the ghosts would be and when they would be there, I'd be rich. But
absolutely. Wow.
Sadly, I don't know when lightning is going to strike, and I don't know where. I just know that it does. And
no, it's not an on-demand kind of thing. Let me ask you,
No.
Jeff, have you ever been researching a story, whether it's for Ghost Adventures or anything else, where it became more than what you originally thought?
Oh, only those are the best ones, right? And it happens a lot. It happens all the time. Where you start digging in. I remember Ghost Adventures. It was season 2, I think, and we were working on a place called Penhurst Asylum.
Yes,
and that's right outside of Philadelphia. And we were the first show to get in there. And I started working on, I'm like, an abandoned asylum. I'm like, I know what to do. We've done that, like, got it,
Right.
and you think it's just a formula. And by the way, sadly, it is sort of a formula because so many of those stories are similar, overcrowding,
Yes.
underfunding, bad conditions. Like, sadly, that is a common thing. However, Penhurst was in a league all of its own. And once we started digging in, you realize why. There's actually a federal law called referring to Penhurst, and it has to do with how you can and can't treat people with mental disabilities because of atrocities that took place there in the 1970s. 1970s, right?
Yes.
Not 1800s, not 17, like 1970s. And it was so bad. And then we started talking to patients that live there, and then doctors who work there, and and you hear about these conditions, and
Right,
you
because
realize
a lot of these people are still alive. That's the thing.
they're
around
alive. They could, yeah, I was there. I mean, when someone can say I was there, this is what I saw. It's powerful,
Yes.
Gosh, I spoke to a nurse who said that her first day, she and another nurse just went down the row changing adult diapers on patients that were just bedbound. And it was about 100 patients. And by the time they were done, it was time to just start again. And she said some of those patients would wipe their feces in their hair and on their skin, not because they're monsters or didn't know any better. Actually, quite the opposite. They did it because they knew if they did that, they would get a bath and some human contact and touch that they wouldn't get otherwise. Otherwise, they're just in the bed all day with no one talking to them, no one touching them, no one hugging them, holding them. They're just literally, like, it's torture. To me, it's torture. There's no other word.
Right. Absolutely.
And so you hear stories like that and you go, oh my, these were people's brothers and sisters and children and cousins and family. And then I've been in that building now a few times, and it's haunting. You walk through that hall and you just say, like, I realized the first time I went in there, I was in one of the basement hallways that connect 2 buildings underground, and I was with Zach and I was with my buddy Dave Schrader, and we were down there and we heard this giggle, like way, way in the distance in the pitch black hallway. And then this rush of air just like goes right by us. We were there 5 minutes. Like, we weren't filming, nothing was going on. And we just all stopped and looked at each other wide eyed, like, whoa, and to me, it felt like the building wanted to talk. the building had something to say, and we were there to listen. And I think, that's telling that story forces America sometimes to look into the mirror and not exactly like what we see looking back at us. Because a lot of us were alive in the 1970s. I mean, this happened when we lived in this country, and like, we can't let that happen again. So if this story can haunt us, if we can, see how horrific this was, maybe there won't be another Pennhurst. That's the sincere hope. When we tell stories like this, and when we go in and we document what we do and talk to patients and doctors who were there, and then, look for ghosts, and whatever those ghosts may be, you can, I always try to empathize with whoever would have been living or working in the place where we are, so as soon as I walk in, I imagine, what would it feel like if I was a patient being brought in here against my will, or if I was a doctor stretched so thin, doing all I can just to, like, not drown myself and trying to help people, like, which is why I got into this work, but, unable to. And a friend of mine who works in law enforcement, and he once gave me the analogy that I think absolutely applies here. He's like, what do you do? Like, how do you live with yourself? And a colleague of his said, it's like you're in a canoe and you're in this lake and there's hundreds of drowning people all around you, and you can save 2 or 3 of them.
And sometimes that's what it comes down to.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And you gotta be okay with that. I saved 2 or 3, and the rest are going to die. And I'm like, I just looked at him and I'm like, man, I couldn't do it. Couldn't do your job. I either save them all or I go down trying.
Right. And that's the thing, that thing where it's like, yeah, that's sometimes the most that you can do. And not to mention, at one time I was doing research, there was another asylum up in upstate New York called Willowbrook. Geraldo Rivera, he did a big expose on it.
We filmed there. Yeah, I know it.
That was like a big deal because he brought in cameras when it was still open and active, and same thing, exposed. Well, I was doing research, and back in the 1932, I want to say, they had a murder because what happened, unfortunately, and even back into the 40s, if you had a child that had some type of Down syndrome or everything, you were urged to institutionalize them.
Sure.
This girl, she had ended up, since she was small, being shuffled around, and she ended up there. She was like 14 or 15. They find skeletal remains. They reconstruct it, which back then it was an avant-garde thing. They reconstructed her from the skeletal remains. And later on, her sister identified her. They figured out because she had blows to the skull, that she had been murdered. Come to find out later on, and these things happen. They kind of dropped the ball on the murder as to who did it, again, because this was kind of like a girl that lived because they actually lived there in this asylum. Even though they weren't kept penned up, they worked on the grounds. This same person that killed her later on, he killed somebody else, but the woman he killed this was in Maine. She was not well connected, but she was not a poor girl that lived in this asylum. And of course, everybody charged in there and caught the guy. And they realized, because he had changed his name, he was the one that had killed this poor girl like 2 or 3 years before. The point being that sometimes what you described as Pennhurst, unfortunately, a lot of these people that lived in these places, even when bad things happened to them, including murder, it kind of fell through the cracks.
Sure.
Where, and even now in current law enforcement, unless they follow through, as to investigate it thoroughly, it just becomes a cold case and fades away. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, in some cases, not all the times, it's also the recipe for haunting sometimes in some of these places. And like I said, Willowbrook is one of those that, from what I saw, it looks like those same thing as Pennhurst, very extensive grounds, acres and acres.
Sure.
Where, for lack of a better word, they were warehousing people.
Yeah, no, of course. And then, what's even worse is that those facilities have all been shut down, and there's still a need. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, there is a need.
Some people could be treated with medication, but I mean, I think our swollen prison population, some of those people need to be in an institution, and if they can't be in one that cares for them, they're incarcerated, and our homeless population. And so the deinstitutionalization in the 1980s was left
a big hole.
it left a giant hole that's still there. And not only that, I mean, it was counter to everything this nation was founded on. I mean,
Yes.
when New York State, for example, every county had to have a poor farm. And a poor farm was like the early asylum, right? Like that's the poor farm is where everyone went, like widows who couldn't take care of themselves or widowers, people with special
Anybody.
needs, people with disabilities, and the community had to pay for it. And the institution had to be as self-sufficient as possible. So grow their own food, do their own, sew their own clothing and things like that. And it was just understood, like these folks are from your community. You have to take care of them. That's just how it is. And everybody knew it.
Right.
And now suddenly, like, we lost that spirit along the way. And it's tragic because the need is still there.
Well, a lot of those huge asylums there, a lot of them were built post-Civil War. And it's exactly what you said. They were built as working almost like farms where they were made, where they would produce products and feed themselves. In other words, to sustain themselves. This was before the state would step in, like you said. And depending on the severity of the some people you could not let out. They couldn't work there, because their mental illness didn't allow them. They were violent, but there were others that they could work there, and they kind of gave them structure and basically a place to live, which is, I think, sometimes where a lot of these places end up being haunted, because most of these people spent 30 and 40 years of their lives actually living within these walls. This is where they lived. Right. And I know that one time when I was doing my graduate degree, I was speaking to one of my professors, and for 10 years, he worked at a men's prison. I want to say it was Missouri, something like that. And he worked like an in-house counselor kind of thing in the prison. And he told me exactly what you just said, which confirmed a lot of these people, yeah, they might have committed a crime, but really their bigger need is mental health.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And they end up in the prisons. And and of course, a lot of their, I don't mean to excuse their conduct if they've done something criminal, but yeah, maybe if they would have had a place to address the mental illness from the beginning, they wouldn't have ended up in prison.
Yeah, no, it's a tragic state, but so I think it's important to tell these stories, and that to remind
absolutely.
people that, like,
absolutely,
we did, and not that was the solution either. As we've learned, sometimes the conditions get horrific because they get underfunded and understaffed, and then that's worse than it not being there. But at the same time, like, they were all built with the best of intentions, and there were times when they worked really well.
Yeah, they did.
The old Kirkbride asylums and things like that. It's I think that the study of history is, of course, the study of ourselves. When you go back, you are a product of not just the people who raised you, but where you were raised. I mean, like, because that has such an influence on the whole, the whole setting of your story. And so for me, like, the study of history is just a way to look at ourselves and understand how we got to where we are, how I got to where I am. I mean, in my own town and community, I look at some of these places and I'm just like, oh yeah, like that's a place that, like, my great grandfather would have worked. And then, and then so on. And then there's this connection, this like thread that sort of ties you from, one generation to another. And you realize we're not all that different. We just have wicked cool phones now.
Yeah. You know what? And it's true. I absolutely, and I'm going to use my years of life. I say, I remember when there was not even a pagers around. I remember even before we had answering machines, and that's not what started. After the answering machines, we went downhill from there. Before,
I don't know.
You know what? People called you and it rang and nobody answered. They would call later.
That's right.
That was it.
And you rolled the dice on the phone. When the phone was ringing, you rolled the dice. You're like, could be someone I really want to talk to. Could be someone I don't. Let's see what it is.
Sometimes, but it wasn't. How can I say it wasn't that on demand that we got going on now? Like, hey, I called you. Why didn't you answer the phone? I sent you an email. I text you. But I'm saying the answering machine, from the answering machine, we got pagers, and then the block phones, and then we became like where we are right now. In other words. And
sure.
You know what? And I'm going to ask you. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, but it's just different. It's not better or worse. It's different. And like, my daughter's growing up in it, and for her, this is normal. So,
of course,
of course. But anyway, go ahead.
Let me ask you something. Do you think, Jeff, because that as our exposure or use of technology rises, there's another part of us that wants the, like you said, the folklore, the romanticized ghost stories, the mystery. That's the opposite of all this technology where everything is explained.
I mean, we always love story and mystery, right? I mean, that's the thing we ponder, and I get that it's also frightening because of these supercomputers in our pockets, and the internet in general, and all that stuff. We have access to more information than humans have ever had in the history of humans, right? There's if you grew up 100 years ago, you might have had a local newspaper or even a regional one,
Yeah.
and most of what you heard came from like your neighbors or at town,
Yeah.
like that was it. It was not a lot of information overload. It was just, life was pretty simple. You had to do your job, whether it was farming or whatever, and you had to, pay your bills and raise your
Yes.
kids and find your food and not be a bad neighbor.
Yeah.
Otherwise life just gets hard for everybody. And so now we've got so much information, and a lot of it, as we've learned, is just wrong and false. And we're
Mhm.
bombarded, and people are frightened by that. And I
Yes.
get it. I understand. A few years ago, I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, and
Wow.
it was 10 days. It was 8 days on the mountain with no internet, no phone, no computer, no
Okay,
nothing.
great.
And after like 3 days in, I realized something. I was like, wow, there's this weird calm and quiet inside of me that I didn't know was missing. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? And I realized, I was like, because day one, I'm like, is my family okay? I'm missing work emails. Like, what? No one can text me. Like, oh my gosh. And then day two, I was like, okay. And then day three, I was just like, the world's going to be fine. It's going to keep spinning
Yes.
while I'm up here on this mountain. And I once I got back, and you turn on your phone for the first time in 10 days, and it's just like, bloop, 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 like all the texts are coming in, all the emails are coming in, and you're just like, oh, I mean, it's smoking. Like there's smoke coming
Yes,
off
it's
the thing,
like
and you're just like, oh, I don't know if I'm ready for this,
yes.
and I can't advocate enough for like unplugging, whether, even if it's just a
Uh-huh.
day, like go sit by a pond, a lake,
Yes.
sit in the woods, whatever you got to do, but like keep the phone off, and get away from it, because like you need to literally reset your brain and your body.
Well, that's what I did. You remember when my son was usually when I put it on silent, I have it at do not disturb, but I make exceptions, of course, for my kids because,
Sure.
unfortunately,
They're
we
your
do that
kids.
worst case scenario. But I try to do that because exactly like what you said, because if not, you get overwhelmed with it's like, which I think adds to our stress level, but that's a whole different show. Um,
Yeah.
Let me tell you something, Jeff. It has been great to talk to you. Can you talk about any projects that you're working on or things, books, anything that are coming out
Yeah.
soon?
So the thing is, like, so Ghost Adventures is still going.
Right.
I'm always working on new episodes, and my weekly podcast, New England Legends, is every week. So there's always a new story, something weird. We do, monsters and ghosts and haunts and weird history. And that's every single week, always going. We're filming new episodes of the TV series. I'm still
Okay.
doing my lecture series. I can tell you, in the first 2 weeks of December, I'm doing my Christmas story tour, and that's super fun. A lot of them are virtual. People can attend from anywhere
Really? That's
with
great.
Zoom. Yeah. So it's called Creepy Christmas. And do not,
Yes.
I repeat, do not bring your young children to that program, or you will have a lot of explaining to do. It's the ghosts and monsters and all the horrific things that have sort of been lost but are making a comeback, to
Okay.
this most frightening of holidays. By the way, Halloween cannot hold a candle to Christmas as far as horror goes. I mean,
Yes. That's,
Halloween's just ghosts. Ghosts don't hurt you. Christmas, though, Krampus will kill you, right?
oh my
Belschnickel will
God,
like
that's a
beat
scary
you up.
figure. Let me tell you, now that you mentioned that Grampus,
Yeah,
that's like, man, that's scary.
I
Could
know.
you
So
imagine
like
telling a kid about Grampus?
it's the most horrifying holiday there is. The sun hardly comes up. You're worried if it'll ever come back at all. It's everything's dead out on the landscape. All the trees are dead. Everything is gone. It's just bleak and scary. And so anyway, I've got my creepy Christmas story tour coming up. Fun for the whole
Great.
family, except the little kids. And and then always working on the next project, because that's how it goes.
What's your website for my podcast listeners? I have a link to the in the credit to the show, but what's for
Sure.
my podcast listeners? What's that website?
It's my name, jeffbelanger.com. And you can also find me on social media, at Exploring Legends for Facebook or Instagram. And
Okay.
always happy to communicate with fellow explorers of the weird.
Yay! Let me tell you something. Why be normal, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's much. Let's not call it weird. Unusual.
I'd like to try it sometime. I'd like to try being normal just for a day, see what it's like. Try it on like a
Um,
coat, you know?
I know it's like it'd be boring. I think I tell everybody it's like it'd be boring. I
Probably,
mean,
yeah.
or like I tell everybody, you know what? This is from Louis L'Amour. Adventure is a romantic name for trouble. You know, it's
Yeah,
that
sure.
kind of. It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it all depends what's going on with you. But again, thank you, Jeff. It has been absolutely wonderful to talk to you, and I wish you the best of luck on all your upcoming projects.
Thank you, Marlene. Great talking to you too.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.
Wow. So did you guys have a good time? I had a great time. I love speaking to Jeff. He is so interesting because, God, if anybody's got good stories, it's him. Because again, he does the research. He does the research for Ghost Adventures. He does the books. He's got. I've been on his newsletter for years now, and again, which is what I've said before. You know, it's not only just the, how can I tell you, the ghost story in the sense of what we see now with paranormal shows, which is the investigation and the camera and the proof and the EVP. There's a part of I want to call it. Well, he made a very good description. The romantic part of the ghost story, which was that apparition that was seen at a certain field or a certain place. Uh, some people thought they knew who it was. Sometimes you never knew. Sometimes they some people could say, well, you know, this happened there, and then after that they saw the spirit of the thing and the whatever. And but nobody ever could concretely say, did that really happen? Did that not happen? Did it stop? Is it still going on? I'm going to give you a perfect example. Right now, I was researching something, and this back in 1919, there's a cemetery in Pennsylvania called Savannah Cemetery. All right. And there was a haunting supposedly taking place that there was, this supposedly happened around 1880, 1879. A young German officer goes out there for a duel. He, apparently, I don't know how they ended up with a saber, using a saber. I don't understand why. But anyway, he got an injury to his head. And the story goes on to say that after that injury, I guess it was a head trauma. He became, that's my modern, description that didn't say head trauma, became despondent, another word for depression, ultimately ended up he committed suicide by shooting himself in the heart on the outskirts of the cemetery. The story goes that if he sat on this big boulder that was there, that supposedly you would look and there was still blood stains on that boulder of where he killed himself, and that in a memorial to him, they took his shoes and his hat and they buried them under that white oak. I'm assuming, because it doesn't specify, that he wasn't buried in the cemetery, whether he was a suicide or not. All it says is that his hat and his shoes were buried under that white oak. But what would happen is the shoes and the hat would reappear outside, and they would get buried, and they would come back out, and they would get buried, and they would come out. And supposedly, and that people would complain of feeling really weird things whenever you went along this area just outside the cemetery, I guess, fence line, where you would get this of being watched and just an eerie feeling. And then, of course, the story of, for whatever reason, that his shoes and his hat wouldn't stay buried. All right. Now, the identity of the soldier doesn't give a name. The exact date, not really. It was reported in 1919. They said it happened 40 years before, so I'm guesstimating 8. In other words, there's no way to verify. Did this really happen? There's not, or one way or the other. Was that the exact year? There isn't. But it's a ghost story. And I love those ghost stories. Okay? Because nobody ever complained of seeing him. Just an eerie, dreadful feeling. And the fact that part of what he was wearing wouldn't stay buried under that white oak at the place where he committed suicide. And by the way, when he mentioned that thing about Christmas stories, and I mean, Christmas being the perfect time for ghost stories, remember, typically, uh, if you, all the Victorian authors, M.R. James, Dickinson, it was, this is what people would do. They would gather, this is cold outside, maybe snowing. You would gather a group of friends. And the best part of, let's say, either a dinner party or a get together, a family get together, was everybody would sit around and somebody would sit there and tell ghost stories. I think that's great. Let me tell you, I think that is great. As a matter of fact, that's one tradition that I think families should get together and still do. And of course, like all things, age appropriate, because, and then unless you put the little ones to sleep, because kids are impressionable. And if you've got a really, really good storyteller, before you know it, your kid wants to sleep with you. So yes, but let me tell you something. Personally, I love it. I love to hear storytellers, like as in person, and I could see where um getting a family to gather around and somebody to tell these stories, whether they're part of the family history. For example, I remember my grandfather, may he rest in peace. He was a policeman for many, many years. Um, and he retired back in the late 1950s. And towards the end, he was the equivalent. This was the time period where you had beat cops. In other words, they had an area, and towards the end of his career, he was that he dressed in plain clothes, and he did the equivalent, even though that wasn't what was used back then. It was like the equivalent of a vice cop. Okay, but back then you did everything. But bottom line, my grandfather would sit down and he would tell me these stories, and I could sit there for hours and hours and hours listening to these stories that he would tell about when he was a policeman. All right. One time somebody shot at him. And this was the time of the 50s when the men's pants were really baggy. And basically, the shot went through his pant leg. All right. And, barely almost hit his leg. The guy obviously aimed for his leg, but since he had those baggy 1950 pants, it just went through the cloth. And, well, what can I say? The shooter got what he had coming. Back then you didn't shoot a policeman. So, and yeah, I love listening to those stories, and I think it's a tradition that should come back. As a matter of fact, I can imagine most, even gatherings of friends. It's like, this is like the best thing. But think about it. Let's do the equivalent of campfire stories, but let's make it a Christmas tradition, a tradition for the holidays, whatever my case might be. Maybe when you got to stay indoor versus camping and you're outdoors. There's a bunch of stories that fit right in. And if you really got somebody quick on their feet, the kind of person that can make up stories on the fly, and they just keep going by the looks on the people's faces, like, oh, these are the kind of stories that traditional scary one with a guy with a hook and the couple in the car and the hook, but you've got some people that really are really good, and they can make stuff up. Just it's like, let's make this story up, and they just pile it on. But again, guys, I hope you like this interview with Jeff. I think it's fascinating, and obviously he's written the books. He does all his work with Ghost Adventures, and all these things are, for a lot of people that sometimes thinks like the paranormal isn't. Oh, it's like it's been run dry. It's like, okay, we've had 20 years of paranormal shows. That's it. It's exhausted. That field has been exhausted. I beg to differ, very much so. The reason why I say this is, yeah, maybe the formula of the presentation is meh, but overall, I think the ghost story, whether it's just the story or whether it's the research or whether it's an active investigation, there's still a lot left to be explored, explained, or just listened to when it has to do that. And I agree with Jeff when he says a lot of these ghost stories sometimes have a lot to do with us, ourselves, our history. Sometimes it's a family history. Sometimes it's the history of an area where you grew up in, or collectively, let's say, as a country, like what he explained in when they were doing the thing in Penhurst, where you're seeing that as recently as the 1970s, you had people being treated so badly because they were just not important in society. And the truth is, by then, a lot of these places were state run, and it takes a lot of money, and they weren't paying. It's a difficult job, so they were thinly staffed. And even if you got a job there, by the time you were there a while, you were ready to leave because, first of all, it's got to be brutal on your psyche. Plus, you're probably exhausted because there's only so much a person can do. So, in other words, it teaches us that, unless we're vigilant about these things, it can happen again. And I'm going to go on a little segue, and I agree with him that a lot of the people, that's not the way they were being taken care of, not that, but that people with certain mental illnesses needed a place for people to care for them, that they can't take care of themselves. If they need certain medicines to be given to them regularly, if they need ongoing therapy. And let me explain. Sometimes it's not just the mental illness part of it, depending on what they've been diagnosed with, that a lot of times these people have lost touch with their family of origin, if they ever had one. Okay. In other words, they don't have anybody to be their advocate as a family member, a mom, a cousin, an aunt, a grandparent, to come and speak on their behalf or make sure that they get treatment. None of that framework doesn't exist for some people. As a matter of fact, a lot of people. And sometimes they themselves, because of their behavior, depending on how extreme it is, have alienated their family. So these people, they do need places to be that will help them take care of themselves. And then you have people that are really, really, unfortunately, they're violent. They're violent and they're danger not only to others, but to themselves, that need constant supervision. But I agree with Jeff. People like that, a lot of times are cast to the fringes of our society. We should make more of an effort to take care of them versus just letting them do what they want, even if what they're doing is really self-destructive. And I think that, like he said, that learning our lessons from our history, us as society, need to step up to the plate just to prove that we've learned from history. That kind of deal, baby. Again, sign up for my newsletter. I've got a lot of great guests coming on. Don't forget, you can go to MiamiGhostChronicles.com. You can go to MarlenePardo.com. And I've got links there to the different podcast platforms where the podcast versions of the show are released. But I also have links there that if you want to listen to any of the podcast versions without commercial interruption, you can listen, because I have an MP3 file for every show from the beginning. I have it on my website. You can listen to it on your browser. You can download the MP3 file. You do not have commercial interruptions on those if you get it directly from my website. Once you jump off to the podcast platforms, chances are, depending which one it is, you're going to get commercial interruptions. So again, guys, thank you so much for being part of my audience. You are all absolutely wonderful. And I will be back next week with news from Chicken Kingdom. And let's see what we can come up with. Like I said, great guests. You're going to be happy, very happy with what I've got coming on. And thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you guys every week. Take care.